The letter arrived in a plain envelope, tucked beneath a pile of bills and advertisements, but something about it immediately felt off. The paper was standard, the font professional, and the message direct: payment required within 24 hours, or the vehicle will be considered abandoned. At first glance, it was just another routine notice, the kind that countless people probably ignored until their car was already on a tow lot, accumulating fees. But as I held the paper in my hands, reading and rereading the demand, my instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. The letterhead matched documents I had seen before from Peterson's Towing, a name well known in our neighborhood for its aggressive tactics, but when my eyes drifted down to the bank account number listed for payment, I felt a chill. It wasn't the same. I had seen previous notices from Peterson's Towing, on my neighbor's table, in a friend's hands, even in an online complaint thread, and the banking details were different. A quick online search confirmed my suspicion. The account number belonged not to Peterson's Towing but to an LLC registered under Margaret's husband's name. That was the moment everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a towing operation. It was a full-scale scam. I sat at my desk, my fingers flying over the keyboard, digging deeper. The more I searched, the worse it got. Margaret and her husband weren't just towing cars. They were systematically targeting homeowners, forcing them into impossible financial situations, and then sweeping in to buy their houses at a fraction of their value. Property records revealed that Margaret had purchased 3 houses in our neighborhood within the last 2 years, each for well below market value. A disturbing pattern emerged as I matched names to addresses. The Garcas had vanished months ago after their SUV was towed, leaving behind an empty home that Margaret later bought for pennies on the dollar. The Santiagos fought the fees for weeks before finally giving up and selling their house in desperation. Every single property she acquired had a common thread: the owners had all lost their vehicles to towing disputes just months before. It wasn't coincidence. It was calculated. Target. Harass. Collect fees. Force sales. It was a cycle, one that ruined families and enriched Margaret and her husband. I felt a sickening realization settle in my gut. I had uncovered something much bigger than just a crooked towing company. By the time I looked up from my laptop, the clock read 2:47 a.m. I had spent hours combing through property transfers, cross-referencing LLC filings, and tracking down legal complaints, but the deeper I dug, the more tangled the web became. Margaret's husband wasn't just involved, he was at the center of it. He had multiple shell companies, each one linked to different aspects of their operation. One LLC owned the tow trucks. Another handled the impound lot. A third managed property acquisitions. It was all connected, all designed to funnel money from unsuspecting victims straight into their hands. I leaned back, exhausted, staring at the ceiling. How many more families had been forced out? How many people had been manipulated into giving up their homes? The thought of it made my skin crawl. This was organized, deliberate financial warfare. I had to do something. But what? Who would even believe me? I was just one person with an internet connection and a bad feeling. I knew I needed evidence, something concrete, something undeniable. I had to keep going. Then, just as I was about to shut my laptop, the doorbell rang. My breath caught in my throat. Who the hell would be at my door at this hour? My apartment was small, tucked away on the second floor of an aging brownstone, and I wasn't in the habit of receiving visitors, especially not in the middle of the night. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. Silence. Then, another ring. More insistent this time. I swallowed hard, pushing myself up from my chair. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door, my pulse loud in my ears. I hesitated before checking the peephole. Kevin Chen. I recognized him immediately, Mrs. Chen's grandson. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hoodie pulled up against the cold. My stomach twisted with unease. Kevin and I weren't exactly close, but we'd spoken before, mostly small talk when he came to visit his grandmother. What was he doing here? At this hour? I unlocked the door but left the chain on, cracking it open just enough to see his face. Kevin. My voice came out hoarse. What's going on? He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for someone. Then, in a low, urgent voice, he said, Mr. Zeit, I work at the courthouse records department. You need to see this. Now. I hesitated, my mind racing. The courthouse records department? That meant he had access to property deeds, legal filings, liens, evictions, the very documents I had spent hours trying to piece together online. If Kevin had come all the way here, in the middle of the night, to show me something, then it had to be serious. But part of me hesitated. Was this a trap? The paranoia creeping into my mind wasn't unwarranted. If Margaret and her husband were willing to go this far to scam people, who was to say they wouldn't go even further to protect their scheme? I exhaled sharply, then nodded. Come in. Kevin slipped inside quickly, pulling a folder from under his jacket. He placed it on my table and flipped it open. My breath caught as I skimmed the first page. It was worse than I had imagined. This wasn't just about stolen cars or shady property deals. This was an entire system of fraud, blackmail, and corruption, one that went deeper than I ever could have guessed. Kevin's hands were shaking as he spread out the documents on my table, his eyes darting to the window as if he expected someone to be watching. I followed his gaze instinctively, my own paranoia rising. The street outside was dark and empty, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Start talking, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Kevin swallowed hard and pointed to the first page. It was a deed transfer, but not just any deed. This house belonged to my grandmother's best friend, Mrs. Delgado, he said, tapping the name at the bottom of the document. She lost her car to Peterson's towing 6 months ago. A few weeks later, she got a notice that her house had been flagged for unpaid city fines. Then, suddenly, her mortgage company called to say she was in default, even though she had never missed a payment. The bank foreclosed within a month. And guess who bought the house? I didn't have to guess. The name on the document was all too familiar. Margaret's husband. My stomach twisted as Kevin flipped to the next page. Another foreclosure. Another victim. Another stolen home. And then another. And another. Each one following the same pattern, and my head was spinning. This wasn't just an elaborate scam, it was a machine. A well-oiled, ruthless system designed to strip people of everything they had before they even realized what was happening. The pieces clicked into place like a horrifying puzzle. First, they towed the car, sometimes legally, sometimes not. That put the victim in financial distress, forcing them to scramble to pay fees they often couldn't afford. Then came the fines, the late notices, the mysteriously unpaid property taxes, the aggressive foreclosure process. Everything was timed perfectly to push people past their breaking point. And when they finally gave up, when they packed their things and left, thinking they had lost everything, Margaret and her husband swooped in and bought the property for pennies. But how? How were they moving so fast? How were they getting homes foreclosed before homeowners even had a chance to fight back? Kevin answered my question before I even asked it. He slid another document in front of me. A court filing. My blood ran cold as I read the name at the bottom. Judge Daniel Halloway. I knew that name. Everyone did. Judge Halloway had been presiding over property disputes and foreclosure cases in our district for years. He was notorious for siding with banks and corporate buyers, for pushing foreclosure cases through at lightning speed. People had complained, of course, but nothing ever stuck. Now I knew why. Kevin flipped to another document, a list of campaign donations. And there it was, in black and white. A direct financial link between Judge Halloway and Margaret's LLC. They were paying him off. He wasn't just ruling in their favor, he was actively expediting the process, bypassing waiting periods, denying appeals, and fast-tracking evictions. My hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just some back-alley scam. This was systemic corruption at the highest level. Banks, judges, towing companies, shell corporations, all working together to destroy people's lives. Kevin's voice was tight when he spoke. I don't know how deep this goes, Mr. Zeit. But I know it's bad. Really bad. I wasn't even supposed to see this. I found it by accident when I was filing case records. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That's why I came to you. I stared at him, the weight of what he had just said pressing down on me like a boulder. Why me? I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a guy who had noticed something was off about a bill. But maybe that was exactly why Kevin had come. Because I had already started pulling at the thread. Because I had already seen enough to know that this wasn't just a coincidence. I took a deep breath and leaned forward. "Do you have copies of everything?" He nodded, but his expression darkened. "Yes, but I'm not the only one who knows I saw them. Someone else at the courthouse noticed me pulling these files. I think they're watching me." My gut twisted. This was more dangerous than I had realized. If Kevin was right, then we weren't just dealing with white-collar fraud, we were dealing with people who had something to lose. People who might go to extreme lengths to protect their operation. And if they knew Kevin was onto them, they might already be coming for him. Noise outside made both of us jump. A car engine idling. Headlights cutting through my window blinds. I moved cautiously to the edge of the curtain and peeked out. A black SUV. Just sitting there. No one got out. No one knocked. But it wasn't moving either. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to Kevin. "How long have you been followed?" His face was pale. "I don't know. I only noticed after I started making copies." We both looked back at the window. The SUV hadn't moved. It just sat there, its presence an unspoken threat. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. Kevin and I had just become a problem for someone. And problems like us didn't usually last long. Tears welled up in his eyes as he slowly placed the folder on the table, his hands trembling with a mixture of shock and rage. The documents inside were damning, pages upon pages of financial records, property seizure notices, and forged signatures, all pointing to an elaborate scheme that stretched far beyond their own neighborhood. The realization hit him like a freight train. His father and Margaret had been running identical fraudulent HOA operations in at least 3 other communities, exploiting homeowners, bullying residents into unfair fees, and using illegal towing as a way to seize property and flip it for personal profit. Each document told a story of injustice: families who had lost their homes over petty rule violations, elderly residents tricked into signing away their rights, and single parents drowning in fees they never even knew existed. He had suspected Margaret of corruption, but seeing his own father's name on these papers made his stomach churn. How could someone entrusted with leadership betray his own community so thoroughly? How many people had suffered in silence, unaware that their misfortune was orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect them? He clenched his fists, his vision blurring. This wasn't just about reclaiming his motorcycle anymore. This was about exposing the rot at the core of their entire HOA system. The next morning, without hesitation, he called for an emergency meeting of Harley-Davidson's board, knowing that this was a fight he couldn't take on alone. As he entered the conference room, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. Around the table sat some of the most influential figures in the motorcycle community: dealership owners, club leaders, and legal advisors, all waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath, then laid the folder out for everyone to see. Gasps and murmurs spread through the room as they flipped through the pages, digesting the undeniable proof of corruption and systemic abuse. "This isn't just about one neighborhood," he finally said, his voice steady but firm. "This is happening all over. People are being extorted, intimidated, and left without a voice. It's time we do something about it." A heavy silence followed before one of the board members, an older man with decades of experience in fighting corporate greed, nodded. "Then let's give them a voice." With that, the Ride-Free, Live-Fair initiative was born, a nationwide legal defense fund aimed at protecting homeowners from HOA overreach. Their own community would serve as the pilot program, but they all knew this was only the beginning. The transformation of their neighborhood happened almost overnight. What was once a place ruled by fear and intimidation became a beacon of hope for homeowners everywhere. The community center, which had long been under HOA control, was repurposed into the headquarters for the Ride-Free, Live-Fair initiative. Volunteers flooded in, lawyers offering free legal counsel, activists organizing town hall meetings, and bikers from all over the country pledging their support. Social media exploded with stories of HOA abuse, and soon, the movement was gaining traction beyond their wildest expectations. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak out began coming forward with their own experiences, revealing just how deep Margaret's influence had run. Meanwhile, the legal team wasted no time, filing cases against not just Margaret, but also the corrupt network of HOA officials who had profited from years of deception. They were ready for a fight, and this time, they had the law and the people on their side. But just as they were celebrating their first victories, a shocking revelation sent ripples through their newfound sense of security. Margaret hadn't disappeared after all. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, Margaret had merely relocated, shifting her entire operation to a retirement community in Florida. But fate had other plans for her. A retired judge named Bill, who had been living peacefully in his new home, happened to recognize her from the viral news reports circulating online. Suspicion turned into action as he began digging into the HOA policies governing his community, only to uncover an all-too-familiar pattern of shady fees, predatory towing practices, and sudden foreclosures. He wasted no time in contacting the ride-free, live fare team, and within days, their legal team was already assisting the residents of the Florida community in building their case. Margaret had been careful, but she hadn't been careful enough. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, other retirement communities across the state began investigating their own HOAs. What had started as one man's fight against injustice had now turned into a nationwide reckoning, with homeowners everywhere standing up to demand accountability. Margaret, once the untouchable queen of HOA tyranny, was now a fugitive in her own game, running out of places to hid as the movement gained momentum. Their own neighborhood prepared for a historic event, the first annual Neighborhood Unity Ride. It was more than just a celebration. It was a declaration that they had taken back their community. The streets that Margaret once ruled with an iron fist were now filled with laughter, music, and the roaring engines of motorcycles. Families gathered to watch as hundreds of riders, some on Harleys, others on bicycles, and even a few on scooters, paraded through the town, their banners waving proudly in the wind. At the heart of it all was the man who had started this fight, leading the ride with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. As they passed by the old storage shed where Margaret had once held her secret HOA meetings, he couldn't help but smile. The shed had been transformed into something far more meaningful, a free motorcycle maintenance workshop for local youth. Every Saturday, he and a group of former gang members, now certified Harley mechanics, spent their time teaching kids not just about engines, but about resilience, community, and the power of standing together. This wasn't just about motorcycles. It was about giving the next generation something Margaret had tried to take from all of them: hope. Just when he thought the battle was finally winding down, a new chapter began to unfold, one that would take their fight beyond the borders of their own community. The media had picked up on their story, and suddenly, national news networks were reaching out, eager to shine a spotlight on how one towed motorcycle had ignited a movement against HOA abuse. Interviews were scheduled, articles were written, and soon, homeowners from all over the country were flooding their hotline with stories of their own struggles. Some had lost their homes over minor violations, like the color of their mailbox or the length of their grass. Others had been forced to pay thousands in fines for ridiculous infractions, like leaving their trash cans out for a few minutes too long. The stories were heartbreaking, but they also fueled the fire of the ride-free, live fare initiative. What had started as a local fight was now a national crusade, and with the legal team expanding, they were preparing to take the battle to an even higher level, pushing for legislative reforms that would limit the unchecked power of HOAs. They had won a battle, but the war against corruption was far from over. In the midst of all the chaos, he found himself reflecting on just how much had changed since that fateful day when his motorcycle was towed. Back then, he had been just another frustrated homeowner, another victim of an unfair system. He never imagined that his personal struggle would transform into something so much bigger. As he stood outside his house one evening, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over his neighborhood, he spotted something that made him pause: a tow truck slowly driving past. But this time, it wasn't one of Margaret's henchmen looking for their next victim. It had a brand new logo on the side: Community First Towing, protecting neighborhoods, not profits. He couldn't help but smile. It turned out that after the downfall of Margaret's operation, a group of former tow truck drivers had banded together to start their own ethical towing company. Instead of preying on homeowners, they were now focused on helping the community, assisting stranded drivers, offering fair pricing, and even providing free services to veterans and the elderly. It was a full-circle moment, a testament to how even the most corrupt systems could be turned into forces for. But the biggest victory of all wasn't in the courtroom, on the news, or even in the streets. It was in the hearts of the people who had once lived in fear. No longer did neighbors avoid eye contact, afraid that a single complaint could lead to retaliation. No longer did they whisper about the latest unjust fine, too afraid to speak out. Instead, they stood together, united by a newfound sense of strength and solidarity. Monthly town hall meetings were held where residents could openly discuss concerns, and a neighborhood council was formed, one that actually represented the people, not the interests of a corrupt few. Children played freely in yards that had once been deemed out of compliance, and elderly homeowners who had once been threatened with foreclosure were now receiving assistance instead of fines. The transformation was more than just structural, it was cultural. The spirit of the community had been reborn, stronger than ever. As the anniversary of their victory approached, plans were made for an even bigger event, a nationwide ride bringing together bikers, activists, and homeowners from across the country. The idea was simple: to show unity, strength, and the power of standing up against injustice. Sponsors came pouring in, eager to support a cause that had touched so many lives. Harley-Davidson itself pledged funding to expand the legal defense fund, ensuring that more homeowners could fight back against corrupt HOAs. On the day of the event, the turnout was overwhelming. Thousands of riders took to the streets, their engines roaring in unison as they carried the message forward: no more silent suffering, no more unchecked power, no more communities living in fear. As he rode at the front of the pack, feeling the wind on his face and the energy of the crowd behind him, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning and the end. The lesson he took away from it all wasn't about revenge or even justice, it was about leadership. True leadership wasn't about controlling people through fear, like Margaret had done. It wasn't about bending the rules to serve personal gain, like his father had. It was about lifting others up, giving them a voice, and ensuring that no one else had to endure the same hardships. He had started this journey simply wanting his motorcycle back, but he had ended up with something far greater: a purpose. As he looked around at the community he had helped rebuild, at the friendships he had forged and the lives he had changed, he realized that sometimes the biggest revolutions start with the smallest injustices. And the best revenge? It wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure that no one else ever had to go through what he did. That was the real victory.